Hello, everyone. This is Daniel from the Particular Baptist Podcast. Now, most people today don't realize how many mortgage options they actually have or how easy it is to choose the wrong one. And that's where Lane Campbell comes into the picture. Instead of pushing you into a specific loan, he helps you understand your options and what makes sense for your particular situation. If you're buying a home, refinancing, or just want a second opinion, you can call or text Lane at 618-671-1830. Again, that's 618-671-1830. NMLS number 2413537. Edge Home Finance. NMLS number 891464. Equal housing lender. Now, on to another great episode of the Particular Baptist Podcast. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us and other podcasts at reformedpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. Sorry, I'm fixing my hair here. I was wearing a winter hat and it messed up my hair, so forgive me for looking a little off today. Speaking of the blog, go and check that out. Andrew did an article a little while ago on Particular Baptists and political theology, which has been making the rounds. We've seen Stephen Wolf reposted it. James Baird reposted it. It's been going around, so go check it out. It's Particular Baptists. We're against secular liberty of vindication or something like that. You can find it at theparticularbaptist.net. Great read, but going around at this point. All right. So today we're going to talk about common grace, a common theological, yes, pun intended, a common theological topic that tends to come up every once in a while, maybe not as much now, but I think in older Reformed theology, I think you find this a lot more. People talking about common grace, people talking about how this relates to how do unbelievers do seemingly good things, right? How do they do those things that are seemingly good, even though they are actually evil? And I think there's at least two different ways to look at the principle. And what I want to do today is look at the principle. I want to look at it from a confessional reform perspective. And is this something that we find, I think, is what we find in modern Reformed theology is the more common understanding of the term. Is that really found in our confessional history, and is it biblical? And so looking at some of the history there and some of the theology behind it briefly. But when we're looking at common grace, I think there's a couple different ways we can look at the principle. I think one that you find, I think especially in the older Reformed tradition, in terms of the principle, I want to be careful here because the wording of common grace is never used in any of our confessions, historical Reformed confessions, and any of the writings to refer to any of these things that we're about to talk about. But I think there's a couple different ways to look at this. One, that God brings rain on the just and the unjust and does good to all men and restrains evil. I think that that's a very common understanding of the term. And I think in principle, that's what you find in guys like Calvin, where the principle merely means that we're talking about God doing good to all men. You know, the unbeliever gets up, goes to a job, puts food on the table, makes money, has a roof over their head, good things that God gives to them. People will refer to that in modern terms as common grace. Again, that terminology is never used in the Reformed tradition ever. That is a modern invention, if you will. in terms of the terminology. And even and I don't and I want to be careful not to use, say, this was what they understood it to mean in terms of common grace, because they never used it that way, and it never was seen as language that needed to be used in the Reform. You won't find it in any of the Reformed confessions, any of the catechisms. You won't find it in Calvin's writings. Okay, so really, people are maybe in a way being anachronistic in how they're applying that terminology. They're applying a term anachronistically, which isn't always a bad thing. I mean, particular Baptist is an anachronistic term to refer to our tradition. I think it's fine if you qualify it, but I think using common grace in the way that it tends to be understood, I don't think is helpful. But when we're talking about the principle of God bringing rain on the just and unjust, and does good to all men, restrains evil, that's a common understanding of common grace. So that's one. Number two, and this is, I think, what you find more in a Kuyperian, Kuyper, that Dutch Reformed guy who tried to address Christians and dealing with culture and trying to reform culture, redeem culture, and wrote multiple works on the doctrine of common grace, specifically multiple volumes on the topic, very, very extensive. But this principle basically would say that man is essentially hopelessly corrupt apart from God, so much so that God must grant some grace in order for fallen man to do that which is good according to the letter of God's law. Now, I don't know if Kuyper would actually come out and say that man is so corrupt that he can't do anything apart from the special grace, but that's where the logic leads. That's where the position leads. And basically, the principle that Kuyper was going at was that there was this antithesis between, or an antithesis against godliness. You had godliness, and then you had the antithesis of wickedness. And he taught that common grace was needed in order for a wicked man who was in this antithesis state of not being able to do that which is good. He needed this special grace, this common grace, if you will, to do good in society. So you can hear the implication there that man must be so bad that in any way, according to his nature, he can't do even what is to the letter of the law good, unless God, in some sort of uh, extra movement of grace, grants it to him. Now, I think Kuyper would distinguish between what we call special grace, where you have God working in a salvific way towards someone, in a special way that he wouldn't towards an unbeliever. But there is a sense where this common grace is still needed in an unbeliever's life in order for him to do anything that would be, at least on the surface, good. And I think this is a pretty common view today in the modern reform world. We know that Kuyper did have and still has a pretty strong influence on reform circles today. And so I think you're going to find that there is this understanding of common grace that kind of throws itself out there, that you're going to find floating around in the reformed world. Um, and it kind of seems that it's said with almost like it's supposed to be taken for granted in terms of the understanding of this term. Like we just talk about, oh, man does good things. Well, that's God's common grace. We use that terminology in a similar way that Kuyper did, basically taking for granted the underlying principles that he provided as it relates to his understanding of man. So, how are we to look at these things? On the surface, it may sound good. I mean, I think we can all agree that God brings rain on the just and the unjust. That's a biblical concept. I think any Reformed confession, any Reformed theologian throughout history would. Sorry, my neck is bothering me today. Would completely agree with that. That principle found in Scripture, and that God, you know, I guess in a sense, prevents us from doing uh, openly wicked things as much as we could. But I don't think anyone's disagreeing with that. I don't think the term common grace is helpful in that sense, um, because while it is true that there is a certain sense where grace is being used, in as much as God does not have to give us any kind of existence whatsoever, and that every good and perfect gift is from above, there is a sense where it's almost like it's stating the obvious, and it doesn't really need to be said. It almost kind of brings more. It almost overcomplicates the situation, right? Because no one's disagreeing that there is some grace involved in God, quote unquote, restraining evil, or that God is bringing rain on the just and unjust. There's nothing that we would disagree on that. But the terminology doesn't really seem to be necessary. It seems to be kind of superfluous a little bit. Um, and then, especially when we're talking about the second option found with Kuyper, that treats man as like in and of himself so hopelessly wicked that he can't even by nature do anything outwardly good. He needs God to go above and beyond him to do that. Um, that would probably fit more within the understanding of, or the terminology of common grace. But again, the principle and I think the terminology are not helpful in this specific instance. And I want to focus on the Kuyperian instance. Again, I think the first, more the Calvin's understanding of God doing good things to all men, bringing around just and unjust. I don't think any Reformed theologian today or any confessional person disagrees that the Bible explicitly says it, that God does good to all men, and that there is a sense where man does not do as bad, openly bad things as he could because God doesn't allow him to. There is a sense where that is the case. We do know Scripture talks about people being given over to evil in a way that others aren't, right? There is a restraining hand that is there in some sense. But again, I think that is an aside to the problems with the Kuyperian understanding of this. So again, the terminology of common grace is really not needed. So in order to have a proper understanding of these things and to take into account what is being said about common grace, at least from the Kuyperian perspective, there are a few things we have to look at. One, we need to know what is sin. What is sin, right? We need to have a proper understanding of sin. We need to have a proper understanding of what man's nature is. What is nature? Is it good? Is it not? But we need to have an understanding of what that looks like. Is something good by existence? And then we need to have a proper understanding of what it means, um, to put those two things together in terms of action and nature. How do all these things tie together? Our nature, what is sin, what is really being talked about when we're talking about human corruption? So I think when we're talking about common grace, at least from the Kuyperian perspective, I think there's a misunderstanding as it relates to man's condition. What is total depravity? Is it really that man is so hopelessly corrupt that even by nature, in terms of just his bare existence, he can't do anything outwardly good, at least? Or, is he so hopelessly corrupt that he needs some special movement of God in order to have him do what it is that he does? So, having a proper understanding of what nature is, nature good, and having a proper understanding of sin are all critical to this discussion. So, we're going to take a look at some of these, and hopefully this will be helpful in clarifying some of this language, clarifying some of this these discussions surrounding common grace. So when we're talking about sin, this is something that's also misunderstood, I think, among most Christians. I know for me, I didn't. I don't think I would ever say that I believe that sin was a substance, but I don't know if I would have said it was a privation either, just because I hadn't really dove into what is sin properly speaking if we're talking about sin. And so, but it has multiple implications that spin off from what sin actually is, and of course, our understanding of common grace is one of them. So when we're talking about sin, we see sin in the Bible, like 1 John 3:4. Sin is lawlessness, right? It's the lack of good. It's the lack of law. It's clearly a missing of the standard. It's not meeting the standard that God has said. There's something missing there. There's a gap between obeying God's law and what the person is doing, right? There's some sort of twisting, there's some sort of mark missed, right? So sin is not some substance that exists in the same way that good does, or that material goods do, or that all things exist are. It's not a substance that's attached to men's body and souls. And sin is in a sense, a privation. It's a lack of good where it should be, but it's also has this corrupting nature where it takes the good and distorts it. So there's no such when we talk about sin in that way, there is no such thing as something being completely corrupted by sin. Otherwise, that thing would cease to exist, and the corruption would then go away, since it has nothing left that's good to corrupt. Because sin requires the good in order for it to corrupt something. You can't corrupt something that doesn't exist. So if that thing went away, that good thing went away, that sin is corrupting, sin would just poof, go away with it, right? So it requires the good in order to quote unquote exist. And sin can exist as a substance, because that would mean that God created it, since the scriptures are explicit that God created all things are from him. So if sin is something that exists, it falls under all things, and then that would mean God created it. So we can't obviously see sin as something that exists in substance like that. And Thomas Goodwin, and I'm going to reference him multiple times, and this is from the works of Thomas Goodwin. I just got this volume recently on Logos, and it's very interesting. Thomas Goodwin, if you know anything about him, he was a Westminster divine, but he was also the co-author of the Savoy Declaration with John Owen. He became an independent later on, in terms of his ecclesiology, and he co-wrote the Savoy Declaration. The Savoy Declaration was one of the confessions that was directly influenced the Second London. So it's safe to say that many of the doctrines that Goodwin taught are going to be believed by the particular Baptists. So there's this broader Reformed tradition they're pulling from, and so you can see, the tie-ins here. But this is from the works of Thomas Goodwin, Volume 10. This is the work of James Nichol, Edinburgh, putting this together. This was an 1865 print. But he says, quote, Goodwin, that in every man's nature that is born in the world, there is a mass of corruption that inheres or sticks in him, which is the principle of all his actions whence they proceed. Yea, which is in some sense the nature of man, as being the predominant quality, which is in all and guides all. So this corruption, notice the term corruption is used. He's not using the term substance as if it exists in some way, like with a human nature, soul and body, but there is corruption that inheres, and he uses the word multiple times about sin sticking in him or inhering in him, right? So it's corrupting that which is good. It's twisting it, it's distorting it. And of course, the idea of corruption, there's this privation, this lack of good. Clearly, if something's corrupted, there's something good that's missing there, right? So there is a privation that's happening here. And of course, he would never believe that sin is a substance, because that would mean that God made it. So it's a corruption of the good. Okay, and you can see this too in Turretin. Turretin, in his Institutes, has a lengthy discussion on the nature of sin and talking about it kind of concretely and in the abstract, talking about it as a privation. He calls it denoting the want of the rectitude or goodness which ought to be in the rational creature according to the prescription of the law, whether it belongs to the nature of qualities or actions themselves, for it deprives all these of conformity with the law and so constitutes them guilty of sin. But he doesn't stop there. He says it's not merely a privation, but it's corrupting, not idle, but energetic, not of pure negation, but of depraved disposition, by which not only is the due rectitude taken away, but also an undue unrectitude and a depraved quality laid down, infecting all the faculties. So it's not just that there's emptiness, but there's a twisting, a corruption where the nature, the disposition of the person is now directed away from God and pointed towards something else. So it actually has a corrupting effect upon the individual. So it's not just merely that something's missing, it's a direction, it's directing the human nature away from God and toward something else. So, and he references actually Thomas Aquinas. He references Aquinas' Summa Theologiae from books 1 and 2, question 82, article 1, page 956, where he says, Aquinas says, as bodily sickness has something of privation, inasmuch as the quality of health is taken away, and has something positive, viz., the humors themselves inordinately disposed. So original sin is not a pure privation, but a certain corrupt habit. So he parallels it to a disease, right? A disease takes something away, it takes health away, but it also has something positive in as much as it has some disorderly disposition of the body where it's no longer toward health but towards something else, right? So that's the nature of sin. And this is important to understand because if we're to take Kuyper's position on its face, where it implies that man is hopelessly corrupt and he can't do anything apart from God's special grace, then that implies that uh, that has implications for the human nature, that there's nothing good in any sense in the creature. And having a proper understanding of sin leaves the basic nature of man as good, being created by God and existing, but it has a corrupt and depraved disposition away from God, and there are actual effects of sin upon a body. We get sick, we die, we have bodily deformities, we we're not as healthy ever as really we can be, because sin corrupts not just spiritually, but it has corrupting qualities in a person just on their natural state. But the natural state is not taken away. They don't cease to exist. They still exist as good, and as much as our flesh, our bones, our blood, whatever is created by God and is good, but it has this corrupting nature that changes the disposition. It has corrupting effects upon us, but it leaves our nature intact, right? We are not annihilated, so to speak, because of sin. And so this has, an effect upon how we understand the nature of things that exist and what sin really is. So those are all things that we need to make sure we keep in mind as we're going through this, and that kind of leads into our next point here. When we're talking about something that's good, is something created good by its existence, or maybe better terminology would be, is something that's created good. The fact that it exists, does that mean it's good? And we get this principle from Scripture, 1 Timothy 4:4-5. For every creature of God is good, and nothing is to be refused if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by the word of God and prayer. So basically, anything that God has created is good in and of itself, in terms of its very nature, in terms of its existence. It is good because it's coming from God. So those are all things that we have to understand there. So creation is good since God made it. And again, going back to Romans 11:36, it's telling us that there are good things, that all things are from God. And if all things are from him, then they must be good since their source is good. Otherwise, that means the source is bad if bad things are coming from the source, right? And of course, that would completely undermine the nature of God as good, whom there is no shadow of turning, right? So our existence, which does not just include just sitting there on the couch in terms of our flesh and our bone, but also our actions, qua actions, meaning the actions as they are in terms of like the movement of them, are good and come from God. So it's not just the cells of men that are created and are good and part of our nature, but the being and movement of man is also good. We see from Acts 17:28, it's very, very clear about that. For this is where Paul is at Mars Hill and he's talking to the philosophers, and he talks about how in him, meaning in God, we live and we move and we have our being, right? So we participate in the divine essence. We exist, we move, we do things because God causes our existence, right? So this includes the movement, right? Actions are a form of movement. This includes our actions, qua actions, since that is part of being and moving. So actions as they are in and of themselves, right, aren't sinful. Okay. So what this does in terms of implications, going back to how we're tying this to common grace, this would mean that whenever a pagan or an unbeliever does something according to the letter of God's law, the act is considered good as far as it goes, since they are doing what is according to nature as per their movement from God, and that they are obeying the letter of law and doing what is good by nature. God is causing them to move. If he causes them to move, to obey his law outwardly, just from the action, qua action, then that is good. And even if, and you can see Bavinck talk about this, I think you see Aquinas talk about this, Dolzal's talked about this, or even in sinful actions, the movement of the action itself isn't what is the problem. The issue has to do with the form of the sin. What is it being directed towards? What is it? What is the inclination behind it? The movement of the action is not the issue, since that comes from God. Since creatures move in God, and that's part of their nature to move and exist, right? But we also have the form of it is only a depravity in the creature. So that's why, like in our confession of faith in the Westminster, I'm sorry, in the Second London. I mean, you can find this in the Westminster too, but in the Second London, it says works done by unregenerate men, although for the matter of them they may be things which God commands, and of good use both to themselves and to others. So stopping right there, that works done by unregenerate men, the matter of them, they may be things which God commands. So to the letter of the law, they're good. They're fine. There's nothing wrong with them per se. And it even says, and they're of good use both of themselves and to others. So they're good in as far as they are doing those things that are to the letter of the law. Those things that are being done at the letter of the law are good. And I think they would agree too, because this is a basic understanding of God's providence, which was the Reformed understanding, is that God causes all things, causes movement in man, causes um, existence and being, right? Man does not exist of his own self will in terms of causing things to come out of nothing like he's God. That would be ridiculous. There's a dependency of man on the first cause that is God. That's basic Christianity. That's basic science, for crying out loud. That's basic a basic understanding of nature. That man does not simply exist of his own self determination, so to speak. And what's in the confessional paragraph here, talks about why actions are sinful. It's not the action itself that makes it sinful, right? It says, "Yet because they proceed not from a heart purified by faith, nor are done in a right manner according to the word, nor to a right end, the glory of God, they are therefore sinful, and cannot please God, nor make a man meet to receive the grace from God, and yet their neglect of them for them is more sinful and displeasing to God." So what makes an act sinful is not the action qua action, it's the deformity of the action, right? They're doing it in a way that misses the mark. They're doing it in a way that is, they're not doing it from a right heart, not doing it from faith. They're not doing it to glorify God, right? They're not doing it the right manner according to the word. They're not doing it out of faith. They're not doing it to the end of the glory of God. And so they're sinful. They're deformed. They're corrupted acts. The disposition of the person is not toward God, but toward himself, towards a creature, right? Which is a disordering of goods. The greatest good is God, so all of our actions should be done to him. That's why it's such a slap in the face of nature when man does things that are evil, because or does things for the creature because it's directing the primary good to something, to a lesser good, right? You can find this in basically any reformed understanding of sin, and especially in Aquinas when he's talking about certain things relating to different levels of good, and God being the highest good that we should aspire towards. And our confession talks in different places. 2 Kings 10:29-31, talking about Jehu. However, Jehu did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. Actually, I think I'm adding a little bit of context here, but Jehu did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin, that is, from the golden calves that were at Bethel and Dan. And the Lord said to Jehu, "Because you have done well in doing what is right in my sight, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, your son shall sit on the throne of Israel to the fourth generation." But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart, and not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, who had made Israel sin. So God acknowledges that he did things that were good, but he clearly wasn't a believer. He was a wicked king, but there were still things, at least on the outward sense, according to his actions, qua actions, that were good, and God even says they are, that they were pleasing to him in some sense. So when we're talking about this Kuyperian understanding of common grace, we have to have a proper understanding of what nature is, that nature is good, and that our movement and actions, qua actions, are part of that nature. What it means to exist as a human being means we're going to act. It's not just, we don't just, we're not just static in the universe and we do nothing. We just float around in space, quote unquote, existing. No, we move. We are constantly doing different things. But all those things are done in God and come from him, in as much as actions, qua actions, our being and existence, all those things and our actions are all part of what it means to exist as a human being. We act, right? We have agency. All those things are there. So that's why, um, tying back to what it means to just exist as a human being, and the fact that our existence is from God and it's by nature to act. There is this understanding, at least in the Reformed tradition, that man doing good things, even as an unbeliever, is not something that requires something special above and beyond his nature. He acts according to his nature, which is to act, right? That those are all things that are there. That was just basic anthropology, it seemed. And I think it's something that you find, like, again, with Kuiper kind of turning that on its head and making man almost, maybe not deliberately, but almost like man has some sort of Gnostic existence, right? Like, nature is bad, it's hopelessly corrupt, so God has to step in and nudge him across the finish line, because he can't do anything, right? But the reform would say, no, the nature of man is to act. And so actions qua actions are good, right? And even more so, those things that outwardly comport with the law of God, right? To the letter of the law. Obviously, they're not doing it fully as it relates to the heart, which is also part of the law. You have the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, which are both required to meet God's law perfectly. But in terms of just the manner of doing what God has said to the letter, it is good. So again, going back to Thomas Goodwin, because he talks about these things. This again is from his works. He says that indeed these are good things, and he's referring to things that unbelievers do that are virtuous, right? That indeed these are good things and are therefore ornaments to corrupt nature, but yet they are good only. But as every creature is said to be good, and what does he reference? 1 Timothy 4:4, right? Which we referenced before from 1 Timothy 4. 1 Timothy 4 talking about everything created by God is good, right? So they exist by nature. They're doing those things. Even the actions of man qua action are good creations from God. And so they fall under this principle. It says every creature is said to be good. Their actions are part of what it means to exist as a creature. This is just really just their nature, right? So, but he says with a natural created goodness, but which reacheth no higher. So it stops there. He's basically trying to underscore that man is not we're not Pelagians, right? We believe that man is have some like inherent spiritual righteousness. No, he's just talking on the basics of anthropology, that man exists, and this is he's doing these virtues by nature, and even says that they are ornaments to a corrupt nature. So these are just good things that are hanging there on the that stand out. They're ornaments, but they're not, through and through what is with the man. It's just what it means to exist by nature, right? But that's why he says, which reacheth no higher. Now, many such good things we grant to be in men, though devils by nature, as the substance and faculties of their souls. And so these good endowments, which are superinducted and infused by the Spirit of God for the good of men, whilst these live in societies together, without these several endowments, the world cannot stand, nor a city be inhabited. But when it is said there is no good in the nature of man, such a goodness is meant as in Romans 7:12, as in Romans 7:12 is attributed to the law, which is there said to be just, holy, and good, so that a spiritual holy goodness is denied to be in man's nature, such as might make us acceptable to God. We deny not, but there is much natural created goodness, such as in other creatures, which yet God hath no pleasure in, when they are not found on the way of righteousness. So basically, he's saying that there is a spiritual wickedness that is really what is being talked about when we say that man is totally corrupt. He doesn't need some special grace of God. Yes, God is working. No one's denying that. And you can even see uh, Goodwin talking about this here. They're superinducted and infused by the Spirit of God for the good of men. So God is still working here. But this is what's happening by nature, by God's sustaining grace of moving men. They live and move and have their being in him. They're dependent upon him for their existence, which their actions are part of. And so by nature, they are going to do good things, but it stops there. They have a corrupt nature. Their disposition is away from God. Their heart is not right before God. And so they don't have that disposition to do things for God's glory. Everything is to the creature. The creature is the highest good, which is a distortion and a depravity of man. So when we say that man is completely corrupt, we're talking in relation to the law of God, which is what Goodwin is doing here. The spiritual holy goodness, that a spiritual holy goodness is denied to be in man's nature, such as might make us acceptable to God. So we're talking about, but according to God's tribunal, in terms of his judgment, we are judged to be unrighteous. Even though we might do things outwardly that are good by nature, because we are spiritually corrupt, we cannot stand before God and say, "Yes, God, look at all the good things I did. I kept your law." But you didn't. You had this disposition away from me. You didn't do these things to my glory. You didn't keep the spirit of the law either. And so that's really where, in terms of standing before God and being acceptable to God from a judicial standpoint, that is where we're going to run into problems, right? So the wicked man cannot stand before God and claim that, well, I kept the letter of the law, so you got to let me in. No, but God will say that it's good in an outward sense, according to the nature of humans to act. And so, because of that, we don't need this extra grace, right? So, if we're speaking of common grace as it relates to man doing things that are good in the world, oh, this billionaire gave his fortune away to help dig wells in Africa. Okay, that in and of itself is a good thing. He's loving his neighbor, right? He's loving his neighbor as himself, at least in some sense, but he might not be a Christian. He might not be a Christian. He's just doing what is good by nature, by existence, but he is, as an unbeliever, not doing it to the glory of God, not doing it with the heart of faith, and his disposition is wrong. So the spirit of the law is being broken in that, right? But we can still say, yes, that's a good thing. And even our confession talks about how something that an unbeliever does may be good to other men, right? It may have great benefit to the world around us. So it must be a good thing if it is to be done. But that doesn't mean when we talk like that, it doesn't mean that when we say that common grace is that man acting good is due to common grace, what's missing there is a understanding that we don't need special grace. We don't need grace to go above and beyond what we do by nature, right? In terms of like some sort of kind of carve out of grace in terms of how it's spoken of. God causes us to live and move and have our being. This is what we do by nature. We don't need this grace to help us go above and beyond what is talked about or what we do by nature. So the Kuyperian principle of common grace that contradicts Goodwin. It's not confessional language. It's not reformed language. It's not biblical language when we have a proper understanding of sin, proper understanding of nature, our existence, what it means for something to be good, right? It contradicts that. You can see very different language. You look at how Kuyper talks about common grace, and you look at how the Reformed tradition talks about it. Very, very different things. There's a different anthropology there. There's a different anthropology. And if you want to go further, the Bible even talks about, yes, you have Ephesians 2 talked about by nature men are children of wrath. That's from a spiritual context. But Paul, even in Romans 2:14, expressly says that the Gentiles, they have the law of God written on their hearts, right? Expressly says that when they do those things that are written on their hearts, they're doing it by nature, right? And he's talking about man's existence of moving and acting, right? They're doing what they do by nature. He says it's natural for man to do the law outwardly. That's what Romans 2:14 is teaching. So, but what man can't do by nature is meet God's law to the letter and the spirit, right? The man must do the law with the right disposition and faith in the glory of God. Otherwise, they are sinful actions inasmuch as they are deformed actions. And so they're not really doing what is pleasing to God as it relates to his judicial standard. So it's important, this discussion is certainly technical and is may not be something that we're familiar with. It may have concepts that might be foreign to what we typically understand when we're talking about man. But this is why it's so helpful to read these old theologians. The technical language, while daunting, maybe, while frustrating, maybe, while boring, maybe, is meant to help to flesh out these doctrines more. Being precise in language is helpful for us to be able to work through the implications of these things, right? One, so that we don't fall into one side of the pit and misunderstand what the author is saying, what the theologian is saying, or what the scriptures are saying, but also on the other side, from a positive perspective, making sure that we are properly understanding what is being affirmed. So clarifications, precise language are needed. And sometimes these theologians are writing to audiences that, they assume already know these things, that they assume already have a grasp of these particular doctrines, at least at a very basic level. And that's why I think you don't see a lot of exposition on some of these fundamentals of anthropology, because there is an assumption that's there that the reader has some grasp of what's going on already at a basic level, and the theologian is just expounding upon those basic principles. You don't have to start from scratch every time somebody comes along and wants to understand what's being talked about, because the audience is already assumed. So when that's why we need to have a proper understanding of these categories. And I'll admit, like on the nature of sin, that's a more recent development for even me. Maybe in the last, definitely within the last 5 years, and it just comes from reading theologians who are recovering, reading these old guys, reading modern, uh, like Dolezal. Dolezal was really what helped me get into this, because he wrote extensively on this topic of God's providence and sin and what does that mean, and kind of opened up the door for me to dive into these things further. And okay, look, these guys wrote on this, and what does the scripture say when it talks about sin? And it has all these different implications for all these different doctrines, and it helps clarify things, right, using this technical language. And unfortunately, common grace, I think, is seen as it. I think I've said this before. It's a doctrine, I think, that's taken for granted, and it's assumed, right, with really not much any kind of critical thought. It's just kind of like, yeah, common grace, God. Yeah, common grace. People do good things, unbelievers. That's just God's common grace. And that's, I think, saying too much. And I think uh, if we're taking the Kuyperian understanding, it's going above and beyond, meaning God is working above and beyond what our natures are. And I can see the hesitancy too from people. It's, especially as reformed people, we love to, beat ourselves up on the total depravity side. We're so bad. We're so evil. Look at us. And yes, we are depraved. And yes, there is none righteous. No, not one. Okay. Nobody's denying that, but we have to have a proper understanding of what total depravity is. And that's really where this whole issue of common grace stems from, I think, is not having a proper understanding of man's depravity. And we get into kind of these sticky situations as it relates to man's condition that really are not what the Bible teaches and what our confessional traditions teach that we say we believe, right? And so it gets us into all these different problems as it relates to talking about the nature of man, instead of having a proper understanding of sin in relation to nature and what does that mean, right? So we don't like to say that there is any good in us by nature, lest we sound Pelagian. I think that might be part of it. There's this reaction that we don't want to sound like we're saying that we have inherent goodness, and so we don't want to say that, instead of putting the proper categories in place and speaking in categorical terms that prevent us from contradicting ourselves and falling into these different theological pitfalls that we certainly don't want to, because we don't want to be Pelagians. That would be heresy. That would undermine the gospel. And we definitely don't want to do that. But we also want to speak rightly about what it means to exist as a human, in dependent upon the first cause that is God. What does that mean? Because that's just as important too. So, anyways, I hope this is helpful, and maybe helps clarify some of these terms more. Uh, Dive in, maybe helps to spur you on to more reading Again, I would go read Thomas Goodwin's uh, discussion on sin, I think it's from volume 10. I got both of those quotes from. Turretin in his Institutes has a really good discussion on sin and man's nature. So there's a lot of good things out there. You can go and study more on this. But anyways, everyone have a great rest of your weekend, Lord's Day, and Lord willing, we'll be back next week. Take care. Thank you for joining the Particular Baptist Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at The Particular B and subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find more of our podcast content. Also check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, become a patron today at patreon.com/theparticularbaptist.